drug development and clinical trials is such a tightly regulated space that this is one of those moments in privacy practice where you don't have to convince people to comply. Their default is very much, risk aversion.
Welcome to Privacy in Practice, the podcast where we bring you the latest insights, practical solutions, and real-world stories from the world of data protection and privacy. I'm Kellie Dupree.
And I'm Danie Strachan. Privacy in Practice is brought to you by VeriSafe, your trusted partner in privacy and data protection. In this podcast, we dig into the challenges and opportunities in privacy compliance, from navigating complex regulations to building a sustainable privacy program that works for your business, not against it.
So let's jump in and get practical with privacy.
Today, we are delighted to welcome Aarthi Iyer to the podcast, a seasoned privacy and legal expert with deep experience across the biotechnology and healthcare sectors. Aarthi currently serves as Senior Corporate Counsel at Cogent Biosciences, a clinical stage biotech company developing precision therapies for patients with rare and serious diseases.
With a background spanning roles at a variety of organizations involved in clinical research, Aarthi brings a unique perspective on the legal and ethical complexities of data privacy in clinical trials. Her previous roles include Associate General Counsel at Dartmouth Hitchcock Health and Managing Director at a consulting organization where she advised on compliance and human subject protection in clinical research.
Aarthi's work sits at the intersection of privacy law, clinical innovation, and emerging technologies. Outside of her day job at Cogent, Aarthi is also a Microsoft Fellow focused on the role of AI in clinical research. We will talk to her today about managing complex, globally dispersed clinical trials and the many ways technology is changing how research and privacy work together to drive successful research outcomes. Welcome to the podcast, Aarthi.
Hi there. It's nice to be here.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you again for making time for us.
No problem. My absolute pleasure.
Aarthi, I want to start off by asking you, is there anything that you've learned in the course of your privacy career? Is there anything that you know now that you wish you knew sooner?
Yeah, there's about a list a mile long, but if I have to prioritize one thing, it's embrace change. As soon as you have a policy or as soon as you have a process in place, something always comes up, whether it's from stakeholders, vendors, internal clients, overall organizational objectives, regulatory changes. It's just be ready and be flexible. It's very much an adaptive environment and evolves as the landscape changes, technologies come. And so I wish I wasn't so, looking for a rule book when I first started or a playbook and sticking by that. Now I realize change happens and we just have to embrace it.
I have a following on question on that. Is there anything in your career that has changed how you think about privacy? Is there anything that has surprised you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in research, and clinical and patients were at the forefront in a different way in terms of interventions and getting treatment and understanding innovation. And now in terms of privacy, definitely the patient has pivoted to the data subject being at the center of the conversation. And that has consistently surprised me because in other areas of legal practice and drug development and clinical trials, it's not always the case that there's so much emphasis on data subjects or the patients. And so this is an interesting area for me that I didn't expect.
This is great. This opens so many good discussion topics. I think I want to go back quickly to the first thing you said. I was reading a parenting blog recently, and they were talking about how to raise children in this age of AI and how adaptability and just ability to embrace change is a thing we should be teaching our children. And I know one thing that you have spent a lot of time working in lately is AI in the clinical trial space. So I think that's sort of the elephant in the room on the change front. And I'll just open that topic and close it again because I know we're going to come back to it later. But then I also wanted to talk to you about this focus on the data subject. I think that's a wonderful thing to emphasize. So maybe before we get into that, let's do a little quick summary of what is a clinical trial and what unique privacy considerations arise in that context.
Absolutely. So I will give, this is definitely not a 101 class. It's a bit of a primer, general summary of what clinical trials are. And so the basic point is that you're asking a question, whether it's about the efficacy and safety of a drug, and you're conducting a clinical investigation, which typically involves patients and either administering the investigational product to patients or doing surveys or, asking something about the intervention and trying to create generalizable knowledge. So really it's clinical investigation and tying it to some sort of generalizable knowledge. And then one step further in clinical trials focused on drug development, the goal is to get enough information about the efficacy and safety of the drug to get it approved and into the hands of patients on the market. So that's overall a clinical trial, very briefly. Privacy considerations and the patient considerations are so nuanced. So the basis of clinical trial engagement with patients is the informed consent. So in the informed consent, there are rules and regulations, including HIPAA here in the US, that speak to explaining what data from the patients you're going to get, what the aim is with using the data, how the data will be stored, who will have access to it, how it will be protected from unauthorized release and disclosure. So that's one layer. Then the next layer is in clinical trials, you engage various sites, for example, academic medical centers, clinics. And so clinics may have their own privacy policies about how they operate and, let's say, about what systems they use to store patient data and how clinical trials can engage and access information from an electronic medical record. That's a whole other layer of governance just at the site level. And then adding to that, there are vendors and technologies that may get data and get information from the research participants. And how are they governed? How are they protecting patient information? How are they transferring the data? Is it secure? Is it encrypted? And then from there, there's definitely the regulators and what their expectations are overall and what they want to see when you submit data even. And was it done ethically? Was it done in a sound and reproducible manner? Is it validated? So these are all sorts of the whirling plates in a clinical trial that revolve around privacy.
At Verisafe, as you know, we assist many clients with their data protection compliance when they're running clinical trials, and we act as the outsourced DPO. And it can be challenging because you have to be aware of these very particular requirements that are very tailor-made to the research you're doing. But you also have to have the basics in place. It's challenging to keep all those balls in the air, to keep your mind focused on all those requirements. When it comes to the sponsor, they're typically the controller, but the site where the research is being conducted is sometimes a processor or sometimes a controller or sometimes even a joint controller. And it often depends on where you're situated in which country. Even the EU member states differ there, and that can be a challenge to manage because you need a bit of an encyclopedia in your mind when you're running a clinical trial, because you need to know, okay, we're now in country X. Here typically the site is actually not a data processor, but it's a data controller. Or we are in France and there is this MR001 methodology that you have to follow to declare compliance with the GDPR to make it easier and to avoid getting approval from the supervisory authority in France. So I have a lot of empathy for the role, but also a lot of respect, because I think in many instances, privacy professionals that work at pharmaceutical companies, at life sciences companies, are privacy pros, super pros, because you need to know the basics, but you also need to know the very nuanced requirements in your particular space.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit on a lot of the discussions that happen internally being at a smaller biotech and in-house counsel as to how to be efficient, get quality information, but also play by the rules. And those rules can be a whole set of rules from many different clinical sites, especially with global trials, many different countries, many different regulators. And so I can say our strategy is to engage professionals, is to engage experts that are conversant in this on a day-to-day basis, rather than trying to keep up with this constantly evolving landscape. Otherwise, I would just be reading all day.
As another guest said, privacy is such a team sport. It really is.
These days, We talk a lot about decentralization in clinical trials because often your participant is being monitored, research is still being done, even when they don't have to visit a specific clinic or trial site, a hospital. I'm guessing that a lot of this started during the COVID period when there were restrictions and lockdowns, but it seems to have become quite a popular way to run clinical trials. What is decentralization and how does it work?
Sure. What a wonderful innovation. Thank you so much for bringing it up. It presents the highest of highs in innovation and also some of the biggest challenges in terms of pushing the field forward. Drug development in general, and especially research, has traditionally been very slow to change. And something as unprecedented and needing change and impacting change as the pandemic definitely brought on more use of decentralized trials. So the notion there is that either some part or maybe a majority of a trial can be conducted outside of a traditional clinical site setting where the research participant is coming in for a visit, getting a number of procedures and tests done or answering questions, and then the visit is complete and then they go back home. So in a decentralized trial, some of that might happen within their home itself, where a nurse practitioner or a clinician is coming to their house, or they are calling in or reporting in or transmitting feedback through wearables, apps, devices, tablets, and they're providing real-time data that way. Or even still, they're not coming in for lab work at the site, but going to another lab facility where that information can be transferred to the site. So definitely there are many decentralized clinical trials or components of clinical trials that are decentralized for the reason of increasing efficiency and convenience. So allowing participants to contribute and participate in whether it's in the comfort of their own homes or minimizing burden of travel and feasibility issues such as that. And then also the ability to reach remote and vulnerable populations. So populations that, for example, may be in a rural area and not as close to a clinical site, but now they can participate and are able to receive intervention and contribute to innovation. So that's really the gist of decentralized trials. And certainly during COVID, this helped so much when a lot of facilities were either limiting the number of individuals inside health centers or shutting down completely at certain points or just making sure to be safe. So it helped a lot in that. And with the development of technology and wearables, sometimes it becomes just ambient and collecting data. So let's say you're doing a data on mobility and balance and control. If you put a wearable device on and kind of go about your daily habits and activities, it might just be collecting data in the ambient versus coming into a mobility clinic and doing exercises of that nature.
But I can think of a couple of privacy concerns there because in some contexts, this could involve 24/7 monitoring. And the question is, are you now recording data that you shouldn't be recording or too much data? Also, other risks with that app because it might not necessarily be safe and secure, but lots of data is being collected the whole time. How do you handle these challenges? Which are the key ones that you can think of and what kind of solutions could one come up with here?
Yeah, interesting points. I think one of the things that we do, especially when we're using technology that wasn't developed in-house, so digital health technologies, we start with the framework of understanding any guidance or rules of the road out there. So FDA has, for example, a digital health technology and remote data collection guidance. So that's a good place to start in understanding what our bounds are and what types of activities we could engage in. Then it moves on to vendor selection or a manufacturer product provider selection and doing due diligence as to what they are able to warrant or comply with in terms of minimum necessary information, collecting only at certain points in the clinical trial, whether they're milestones where we need data, not just 24-hour ambient monitoring, making sure that they've been vetted. And then the third tier is definitely involving the sites. So the sites are our conduit still to patients and to talk to them saying this is what is going to happen. This is where you can shut off or you can report complaints or issues. There always is a human in the loop at any time. So it's not just systems and tools doing the work, but humans providing oversight, right? And through all of that, we develop manuals and protocols to follow and operating procedures, whether it's the vendors, whether it's the clinical trial team and the staff that are engaging with patients, and then certainly to patients who are using these technologies, providing them training, support, assistance that way.
Can we go back to that vendor management piece just for a second? Because I think this is something that is relevant to everybody outside of clinical trials. And in a way, the vendor management process you need to have is perhaps gold standard by virtue of the amount and sensitivity of the data that's being collected. Choosing a good vendor is probably critically important. And I imagine there's lessons that can be pulled out in that from your analysis of these vendors for people outside of the clinical trial.
Specifically when it comes to wearables and apps, you have vendors involved, but that is quite a challenge, I find, not only for clients involved in the running of clinical trials, but many organizations, is how to manage vendors, specifically in a situation where these apps might not necessarily be developed for organizations that run clinical trials, or even if that is the case, the vendor might not necessarily be in the US. It might be in a country that has questionable practices or where there's surveillance happening. How do you approach this? Because it's such a key tool in your toolbox when you're running a clinical trial. You need this data and you need to collect it. And in many instances, you're not going to develop the tools yourselves. You're going to rely on vendors to help you do that. But where do you start? How do you mitigate against these potential risks?
Luckily, the clinical trials space and vendor engagement has been a longstanding process. And so there are some sort of vendors that are known commodities in the space that have adapted and offered their products or pivoted their products to be able to function in drug development and specifically in clinical trials. So without naming vendors particularly, there are some app vendors that originally released a health app, and now there's a health app with research mode in it. That's one example where they've sort of set their service model to include clinical trials and clinical trial considerations. So some apps even have a built-in consent screen where if you were just using it ambiently for health, it might have some terms and conditions that you check through, but this specifically has a HIPAA compliant consent screen. And to answer your question, initially, the first step is due diligence. So any vendor we select, we work with partners like VeriSafe to have them complete questionnaires about their privacy practices, data security, data transfer, how often do they audit and validate, and any reasonable regulatory actions that have occurred in the near prior history. We check all of this before we engage a vendor. And as I mentioned earlier, sites will also have preferred vendors that they say, oh, we've worked with this vendor and it's worked out really well. So it's a bit of a conversation and a dialogue. We don't do anything in a box. And in terms of vendor management, there are teams that just do that internally at companies, believe it or not, that are checking in day to day or engaging vendors sort of in a help desk support manner where as and when issues come up, vendors are able to speak to it with knowledge and troubleshoot quickly. The other piece about vendors is that most of them understand the life cycle of a clinical trial, that there's sort of initial enrollment phase where they may not have so much to do, and that gives them time to kind of learn and try things out and pilot test models and tools that may work and tweak things and databases. And then from there, when it's actually full data collection mode, they'll be in place and we'll have tested them enough. We'll have gotten sort of a playbook in place and how to communicate with them best. And then from there, once we do database lock, if we have questions about the integrity of the data or to validate any of the data, we go back to them. So there's sort of a cadence and a dance, but it all starts with looking at the regulations and then looking at doing vendor due diligence and getting feedback from sites.
When I first started working with clinical trial sponsors, I remember being so happy that the quality team existed and that they had quality audit and this robust process in the IT team. It was sort of like, I don't have to convince everyone you're doing this, you know? And I think sometimes the bigger challenge is almost slotting into the existing vendor management policies from quality or whomever else without kind of messing up the very established, well-greased, effective processes, just to throw your privacy team a little bit of connection there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so interesting because drug development and clinical trials is such a tightly regulated space that this is one of those moments in privacy practice where you don't have to convince people to comply. Their default is very much risk aversion.
Absolutely. I love working with clinical trial sponsors for many reasons. That's one of them. But I also think that when we were talking at the very beginning about like all the different privacy considerations here, it is a very crowded space running a clinical trial from a legal perspective. There's a lot of things to consider, and privacy is only one of them. And just to flag for anyone listening who's interested, there's certainly like EDPB guidelines on the interplay between the GDPR and the EU clinical trial regulation. There's a lot of understanding that there's a balance that needs to be struck. Like we need to play nice with each other. Privacy can't be the only legal framework here. And in fact, and sometimes often takes a backseat. Very important ethical and country-specific regulations about retaining data because you need it for accuracy and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And just fairness and equity. So reaching out to patients that may be vulnerable where you're getting more sensitive data, which may pose a risky endeavor, and you may have to have more safeguards in place, but it's very important to get that data for the robustness and the integrity of the trial and the ethics of patient selection as well. Absolutely. Spot on.
And transparency. That's always a challenge, I find, with data protection, because you have to make sure that people know what is being collected, what is being done to it or done with it, and who it's being shared with. And I think that's one of the nice things when it comes to wearables and apps. It's almost easier to then be transparent because it's not the kind of process where there's a privacy notice at the beginning of a very long project and no one sees it again. When there's an app that you download, you can then at that point be transparent and tell someone what's happening. And it's just easier to be in their face and be clear about what is happening. But it is a challenge to make sure that it's done properly and that it's clear enough to people and that they can understand what you're saying, bearing in mind that these are often vulnerable people. And it's a challenge to make sure that that information is communicated to them in an understandable way.
It's interesting that you make this point because part of clinical trial design and sort of the gold standard of a randomized clinical trial that's blinded and even double blinded, a lot of participants will ask, well, can I see how I'm doing? Can I see my data output compared to the rest? And there's this sort of transparency issue because in a blinded trial, to preserve sort of that blind and to preserve integrity, keep it conflict free, to preserve the ethics, you don't release the data except for certain milestones, and you don't sort of release it patient by patient basis in real time. And a lot of times when you consider data subjects and their rights to their data, their rights to correct their data, to remove their data, this can often be sort of a endeavor to figure out how to make sure that the clinical trial design works in the jurisdiction and for the patient population of interest.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I also think sometimes we underestimate trial participants in the sense that many of them really want to contribute to research. It's not a selfish endeavor. They legitimately are participating because they want to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with more and more access to information and different portals beyond the internet, social media, patient advocacy groups. Everyone is really like the trial participant of today is much more informed, much more empowered to ask questions. And they do. And now we're even seeing a lot of patients and patient advocacy groups help in designing clinical trials. And we were talking about decentralized trials, helping, to create a framework that makes most sense for a patient.
That's actually such a great segue to the topic I alluded to at the beginning, that I know you are a Microsoft Fellow in addition to your day job. And as part of your Microsoft Fellow role and identity, you do research into AI usage. And there's some interesting ways that it could actually make clinical trials better or lessen impact on data subjects. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the positives of what you're seeing in AI development in clinical trials?
Yeah, had the opportunity to be a Microsoft and Society Fellow, understanding what opportunities and what challenges there may be in integrating AI into drug development and specifically clinical trials. So the opportunities, which are a lot of them are in play in practice. It's here and it's developing, but it's still sort of early days in getting all stakeholders to think sort of the same way and row in the same way. The opportunities are in terms of patient recruitment, going through and looking at a medical record or a data warehouse of patients and understanding how many patients have the particular health outcome of interest, or maybe where they're located geographically, which clinical sites should we target, how to get patients enrolled quickly. That's one space that's really, really taking off in terms of AI use, is to target appropriate patient populations. The next piece is for drafting documents that are readily available and replicable in each clinical trial. So consent forms, they have certain requirements of how they should read and what they should be saying and transmitting to patients, to ethics committees, et cetera. So developing those documents, developing documents for regulatory submissions. And then also there's advantages in using AI to help with imaging or evaluating data that's come in. So a lot of radiologists and in oncology trials, they use AI to supplement what they're seeing to try to find markers within an image to kind of supplement what they're understanding, support, enhance, and increase data quality there. And then an interesting recent area is using AI to simulate synthetic control arms in clinical trials, because as you can imagine, there may be scenarios where there are vulnerable populations and there's an ethics to having a placebo group and enrolling a placebo group. Like I mentioned, certainly in oncology, there's lots of issues to consider there. Some, it may just be a rare disease where it's hard to identify participants and enroll participants. So a synthetic control arm trial, which the FDA has initiative and is apt to look at and help get in place. There are some, but again, it's sort of a developing area that doesn't have uniform and standardized rules of the road or policies or framework, but it's very exciting and promising in terms of innovation and reducing the burden on the sponsors, the sites, and as well as patients, right?
It's so compelling, especially in those rare disease situations where you can't get enough people for a control group, or it would take a long time to get enough people for a control group. Or as you say, I'm sure there's significant challenges, and also what a cool application.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can imagine for pregnant populations or pediatric populations, having synthetic control arms may increase sort of data reliability and quality.
But as with all AI, Kellie mentioned risks and challenges. Because even if you're now simulating this, let's assume you're using AI, but what is it being trained on? Is the data that you're training your model on accurate? And did you collect that data appropriately and lawfully so that you can train your model on it? And was it the right group? Could there be some bias involved in this model because it was trained on one population where you're trying to find a cure or a treatment for someone in a different type of population? So challenges, but opportunities nonetheless. And I think really good for privacy from a certain perspective. This is definitely a privacy enhancing technology, a pet, and we'll talk about that in a later episode. So I'm not going to now launch into a discussion about privacy enhancing technologies, so-called pets, but this is a nice way to collect less data but still achieve that purpose, and maybe even collect it in a better way and achieve your purpose in a better way and quicker.
Yeah, I think you've hit on some of the areas and the pain points and the sort of things that need to be massaged further amongst the clinical trial community across its stakeholders. There are stakeholders that are very reticent because there's no one uniform guidance about using AI in drug development and specifically in clinical trials. There are codes of conduct. We're seeing them pop up from different associations and different vested interest groups, but nothing at the sort of government level that, again, in a highly regulated industry and space in terms of privacy and just overall clinical trial implementation, people are resistant to change without those rules of the road. And the other thing is in terms of readiness, so educating and training staff on how to use AI tools, how to flag potential problems like bias or fakes or any of that kind of issue that may pop up, and validating the data against real world information, I think is a public-private partnership You still need to have sites involved to understand what good data sets look like, what replicable data sets look like. Vendors and developers of AI tools can't be doing this just by themselves and shouldn't be, just because there's so much data out there. I think people who've done standard clinical trials would be the best to know which repositories are good and what is a robust representative data set. And then beyond that, like I said, patients, getting patients involved. At this point, should they be informed about the use of AI tools or an AI tool to help interpret their imaging data, for example? What if they want to ask questions about it? What if they don't want that tool to be used? What rights do they have? So there's layers to this onion. And as we peel one, questions, discussions are happening, documents are coming out. So hopefully it will progress and evolve as we go.
If you had to offer advice to somebody sitting in your seat, sort of trying to wrangle all those spinning plates of privacy that's interested in trying to incorporate some of these AI ideas into a trial, do you have any quick advice for them? And sort of what should you be focused on here? What do you really don't want to screw up, or what are the first thing you should do?
Yeah, I think it's important to know sort of operational objectives of your employer, of the company that you're in, or operational objectives of your client. If you're doing work for a pharmaceutical entity or for a clinical site or at a CRO, it's important to know what their operational objectives are. Whether it's we want to enroll 20 patients by the end of the year and get data lock in the next year, and here's how we want to use these tablets and these devices to get the data. Then sort of what you need to focus on and what knowledge that may be circling in your brain that doesn't apply, how to filter that out. Somebody who's starting out in the field or new to a project, it's very hard to filter out all the eagerness and kind of be almost too conservative and too restrictive and just focus on sort of what the priorities are. That would be definitely one piece of it, the operational priorities. From there, systematically evaluate legal parameters and tools and privacy considerations and bringing in experts. I don't think anyone can do this particular role just by themselves. There's so much out there to be gained through collaboration and partnership and brainstorming and problem solving together.
That's great. And I love the first part of your answer in particular, because I think one thing that people maybe new to the clinical trial space don't appreciate is how much research goes into what you are testing before the trial even starts, before you even consider patient enrollment. And the company is often created for a specific purpose of testing a specific thing or investigating a specific question. There's so much thought from so many smart people into how or whether and when and all the particulars of how that's going to happen. And so I think it's such good advice. If you're new to the space, there's a million questions on your mind, but you should know where you're going. You can outscope a lot of those questions. Probably everything will feel new to you, but outscope the irrelevant stuff and it will be a little less daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say attend conferences, attend sort of offerings where there's knowledge base and discussion and discourse happening. That would be another way to see what industry trends are, what best practices are, but also dialoguing with colleagues who, sort of go through the same thing. A lot of times it's learning as you go and or building the plane as you fly it.
From the clinical trials that I've been involved in, to me, it seems that in many instances, people stare at the ICFs and they think that that's sufficient when you're running a clinical trial, making sure your clinical trial privacy notice is in place and the ICF is compliant, and that's it. But I find that the challenge with a clinical trial is the whole process. You have to design for the whole process. You have to have your initial documentation ready, but throughout the process, you have to make sure that you manage your vendors. You have to make sure that you prevent potential data breaches, and that happens. It's part of life, but you have to train your people. You have to make sure that they're sensitive to potential unauthorized disclosures of patients' data. You have to also stay abreast of all the continuous requirements that keep on coming out in each jurisdiction where you might be running a clinical trial. From your side, is there one thing that you wish all clinical trial sponsors knew about privacy? I've now mentioned a couple of things that I pick up and I can go on forever, but if you had to put one thing on the notice board when it comes to privacy, what would that be?
I would say engage experts early. That is definitely because no one privacy professional knows everything. Back to the start of this conversation, everything evolves so quickly that as a biotechnology company, the focus is exactly as we've discussed, is to get something to the market to help patients. And there's so many moving pieces, privacy being a component of it, that not everything can be done at the same time by one person. So to engage experts and engage resources and be systematic about it.
Well, we like that answer. Can I also answer that quickly, Danie? Because I had an immediate reaction to your question.
Please do.
Pseudonymized data, key-coded data is still personal data.
Everyone in research, not just in clinical trials and the health sciences. I spoke to someone that does research in the psychology field the other day, and the person said, it's all fine, the data is anonymized. And I asked, explain anonymize to me. And they said, oh, we have the data, but codes next to people's names, and then they remove the names. So that's not anonymization. How's that anonymous if you still have the codes and you have your reference book and you can still go and determine who person A or B is? And I understand why there's this confusion, because in different disciplines, different terms have different concepts. So I'm not judging anyone or blaming anyone, but I think it's important for people to understand that your anonymization might be our pseudonymization. And when it comes to the law, we have to make sure that we apply the right principles, and that when something is truly anonymized, fine, but otherwise we have to treat it as it's pseudonymized. I'm glad you phrased that.
Aarthi, thank you so much again for your time. I'm really excited about, I know everyone's scared of AI, and with good reason, but I personally am really excited about some of the potential. It's nice to focus on some of the positive things we could use it for. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for all the very practical and thoughtful things you had to say. It's been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, I'm so honored and, so happy to have this conversation. My brain is already spinning about other things I should look up and think about. So this is motivating and adding more work to at the same time. But it's so good to participate and reflect and talk about these things as a group. So I'm honored, and thank you.
It's been great. Thanks so much, Aarthi.
That's it for today's episode of Privacy in Practice, brought to you by VeraSafe.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email to podcast@verasafe.com.
And to learn more about VeraSafe's data protection and privacy services, you can visit us at verasafe.com.